Hello guys, welcome back. Today we are looking at Grapes of Wrath, one of the great American novels written by one of the great American writers, John Steinbeck. Like all great literature, regardless of when it was written, there are a lot of themes here that are timeless, and there are some important aspects that we're still struggling with today. Like it seems that in the past 100 years or so, we're still fighting to learn these lessons. And in other aspects, some of the lessons and some of the things that feel really grounded and very strong in this novel almost come off as a lost art or something that has been forgotten over the years. And then we're going to touch on that quite a bit after, because I think that's kind of the crux of this novel, and it's one of the really, really strong and important messages that it kind of leaves the reader with once you're finished. There are still a lot of concepts that we're dealing with today that come up in this novel. The industrialization that happens in this novel that pushes farmers off of their land kind of resembles a lot of what automation has done today to the workforce. We see profits put before people as farmers are driven off their land because there are more efficient and profitable ways to farm that doesn't require a whole family anymore. And it doesn't matter if that is a good family, it doesn't matter if they're great people, it doesn't matter if they're hard workers, if they're not generating profits, none of their concerns really matter, and they're going to move on and choose the thing that is going to basically fatten the bottom line as much as it can for whatever corporation is available. There's literally a scene in this book where they are ruining crops because too many crops creates too much supply and drives down the profits, so they control the supply to keep the money higher. And people are literally starving by the side of the road as they watch these crops get ruined for the sake of profit. It wasn't so long ago that we were seeing in the news how crops were being thrown out because of consequences of the COVID-19 lockdown and the supply chain just not being set up to bring that food to people who need it. And there are definitely people starving across the country as we're throwing out thousands of tons of potatoes and onions and all these other things just because that's how the system is set up. And that's one of the things that is so powerful about this book, is that it captures kind of less the details and mechanisms that allow this to happen, and kind of sheds light and puts a lens on the direct families and people who are impacted by this. And then we have some of the things that are lost, the incredible sense of family and community and pushing through regardless, and pushing through not as an individual but together. And that cohesiveness of community and family feels so strong in this book. And one of the things that really, really resonated with me, especially now that I'm a father. Now, the brief synopsis of the book is not exciting at all. In fact, when I read the back, I couldn't think of something that would bore me more. It basically deals with Depression-era Americans in Oklahoma who are driven off of their farm and need to cross over to California to look for work. Once they get to California, they realize things are not quite as they seem. Things aren't what they were promised they would be, and the difficulties kind of continue, and they have to navigate that struggle as a family. Now, the book starts off with Tom Joad, who is an ex-con who comes back to his hometown after several years of being in prison for accidentally killing somebody in a fight. He comes home and realizes that that's when his family has to move. He runs into the preacher named Casey, who is another main character in this book. I would argue that he's the only main character outside of the Joad family themselves. And that's when they first start embarking on this journey. Now, the first impression that you might get as you read the beginning of this is that Tom Joad is the protagonist, but as the story progresses, you realize that it's not really Tom, it's mostly the family of the Joads themselves, because we go from character to character to character, and we kind of get a taste of each one of their struggles, each one of their conflicts, and how they manage that burden as they cross the southern United States over into California for more opportunity. Now, it's not just about the Joads. This isn't just a book about one family. It's a book about America. It's a book about transition. It's a book about industrialization and the effects that has on people themselves, how the mechanisms of society can impact an individual more so than just the metrics of whatever that society can produce. And as such, these chapters are kind of staggered side by side. So one chapter will kind of address where the Joads are going, what's happening to them directly. And then the next chapter right after will kind of be a sweeping generalization of what's happening around the country at large, particularly with a focus on the general area and the types of people who are featured in this book, which tends to be more working class, more farmers, and kind of the industries in the States and in North America that I feel like we're not used to seeing today, because today we're in such a digital age that we kind of see, I guess, the inner workings of our countries in kind of their products and not how those products are made. Whereas back then there was a lot more farming, a lot more domestic goods that were created. So you get a lot more of kind of a national impact, a national feel for how this confined society is transforming into this new thing, as being kind of ushered along this 20th century arc into what it's going to eventually be known as today. So many stories center around a hero or an individual, very focused on a singular person, and that is very common because it allows us to relate to that character. It allows us to superimpose maybe some of our ego into that character and follow them on a journey, and maybe take lessons that we can directly apply to our own lives. However, this book takes that lens and it pulls it back a little bit and focuses it more on family and community. Again, something that really resonates with me quite a bit now that I'm a father. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that background noise. One of the many joys of living here, we're going to be moving soon, so I will have a new background and probably some better recording equipment set up in the new spot. This book is so centered around family and community, which I find very, very refreshing. Of course, because again, a lot of stories are individualistic, but also because it really seems like we're becoming more and more insular, where we spend less time with one another in person and we spend more time in this digital space where we're much better, I guess, behind the veil of anonymity, at finding the details to argue and shout at digital representations of one another, instead of looking a real human being in the face and seeing them more as your neighbor than as an adversary. And I know that might sound like a little bit Mr. Rogers, but to be honest with you, we could probably use a little bit more Mr. Rogers these days. And with these themes and with the events that happen in this book, there are so many tender moments, and those tender moments culminate into the final scene of the book, which I found absolutely perfect. And I can understand how somebody would read that and consider it a little bit weird, but if you really understand and internalize, again, the themes of this book, the central message of this book, what the Jodes are all about, then the last scene is really the pinnacle, the peak of how you can express that. And I thought it was a genius way to map it out. I thought it was a great scene to end on. I thought it was incredibly powerful, and I love how he brought us there. Now, one of the things that made me fall in love with this book were the characters. Of course, we do start with Tom Joad as he comes back, and one of the first characters that I fell in love with was Casey. And Casey is the preacher who has kind of given up preaching. And it's interesting because he decides to join the Joads, and they're constantly trying to pull him back into his role as a preacher, which he just doesn't feel comfortable doing. Something's missing. Internally, he feels like this is less a time for preaching and telling other people how to live their lives and more of a time for listening. There's a different call, a different understanding in the preacher that he kind of shifts his perspective with and tries to use that in a different way to help the people. He senses inside himself that something else is needed right now, and it's not telling other people the blueprint of living a good life, but holding their hand and walking them through it, and maybe even taking the lead and making the hard call. You have Rose of Sharon, or Rosa Sharon, depending on how she's referred to, and she's actually pregnant and has to carry her unborn child across the states during this time. Steinbeck does a magnificent job of capturing the innocence and authenticity of youth as the little kids, Ruthie and Winfield, run along on this journey, and they have no sense of the tragedy, of the burden, of the weight of this kind of thing. They kind of ground the reader in this strange juxtaposition between the tragedy that the family has to go through and how innocent these kids behave and how childlike they are able to maintain themselves throughout the entire book. I remember learning about Japanese internment camps during World War II and watching interviews from people who were in those camps as children, and when they were asked what it was like or the difficulties of it, they usually came back talking about how they didn't really see it the way that their parents saw it, mostly because they were still kids, and kids don't process things the same. They don't understand kind of the blueprint or the paradigm under which they live, and the difficulty of when that gets shifted or destroyed so brutally and so suddenly. So for them, it's almost part of the journey that they go on through. And even when tragedy strikes certain members of their family, Ruthie and Winfield still kind of keep this very strange innocence about them that really kind of, again, provides an interesting juxtaposition against the backdrop of the burdens and difficulty that the Jodes have to go through. And above all, Ma, Ma is the glue of the family. She's the one that holds it together. She is the one who seems worried in the beginning and wants to make sure that Tom doesn't get in any more trouble. She's the one who makes sure that Ruthie and Winfield don't get any taste of the tragedy that is touching their family. She is the one who is staying next to the bedsides of the grandparents as they get sick and have a hard time carrying on with the journey. She is the one who picks Pa up when Pa loses faith. She is the pinnacle of strength, the matriarch, the one that holds them together, and also has some of the most powerful pieces of dialogue that I have ever read. When Maud talks to Rosa Sharn about how dying and bearing life are two sides of the same thing, it is one of the most touching scenes that I have ever read. When she talks about how I can't remember what chapter it's in, but it's something like she talks about how woman experiences life continuously, and man experiences it as like big choppy transitions. Like it's a big event to big event to big event. The man isn't able to kind of sink into the moment and flow through and understand everything in its kind of entirety and its togetherness. And I resonated with that huge, because I definitely see the world a lot of the time like that. It's these big triumphs or tragedies that mark the defining aspects of it, and the entire time the women in my life kind of undergird that all with a stability of presence that I just don't seem to be able to tap into. And when I saw that articulated, and not just articulated, but articulated by a male writer as well, I was like, well, of course this is the book that is as esteemed as it is. And of course Steinbeck is regarded as the kind of writer that he is, because his ability to translate these ideas and to do so in an authentic way that doesn't come off as a preachy message is phenomenal. Ma reminds me of my mom, of all good moms, of the power of motherhood and how it is something to be revered and respected, and an incredibly a keystone aspect of the family unit, right? Something that's necessary, something that if you have one, you know how great it is. And for some people, it's all they have, and it's the anchor, it's the root, it's the thing that allows their kids to grow from the strength that they place before them. And that comes out nowhere more strongly, and I've never read that in a better expression than I have in Grapes of Wrath. And one of the things that touches me so strongly about this book is that no matter how hard up the Jodes are, no matter how much they are suffering, if they find another person who is suffering, they are literally willing to give a piece of almost nothing that they have left just to help these people along, just to pick them up and bring them along on their journey. This level of selflessness, this level of community, of togetherness, of pushing through, of overcoming hardship, and not doing it alone because of some, BS mythical hero's journey that you believe you're supposed to achieve. The reality is, more often than not, you need help, and you get through together. And that is the function of family, and beyond family, that is the function of community. And nowhere does that come through more in a more powerful way than it does in this book. And if you are somebody who has ever been hard up or has ever been struggling, that is incredibly touching, and it's empowering to think that can still exist in the world. When this book was recommended to me by a friend and writer named Kristen, she as soon as I finished reading the book, I explained these thoughts to her, and one of the things she said that I 100% agree with is the book makes you want to be a better person. It makes you more empathetic, and that's again one of the hallmarks of great literature, is you leave the book not just with a great story, but with a feeling, with a thought, with inspiration to enact the themes of the book in a true and honest way. And the themes of this book are empathy, our community, our togetherness. It literally makes you want to be a better person. And I think a lot of the message of this book really eliminates the differences between people, right? It's really not about what your political affiliation is, right? It's not about the details that separate people. It's about the common ground that we're all suffering through, because by and large, most people are good people just trying to get by. And the little nitpicking details that we like to argue with one another about are far less relevant than the things that bind us together. There's a saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I would have never picked this up if I just was forced to read this in school, and I would have never picked it up just based on the copy on the back cover. But after getting through this book, I feel fuller as a person, with more appreciation, more empathy, and the desire to do better. And what more can you ask from a great book. So this is 100% a 5 out of 5. I wouldn't recommend this to everybody, okay? But if these themes are something that you need to hear, if it's something that you need to read, if it's a side of life that you need to be exposed to, please check this one out. It really is worth it. And yeah, love this one. All right, guys. If you like this video, if you like this review, please hit the like button, especially hit that subscribe button. It would help the channel out a ton. And I will see you guys on the next video. Os.